Hi everyone, I'm Lee, and you probably already know me as someone who likes Dragon Booster, and I was the organizer for the past Dragon Booster fanzine. I've made quite a lot of fan work. I've even managed to get in contact with Rob as well as organize a few Q&As with him in fairly recently. So I thought I'd make this Dragon Booster video essay because why not? Haha. I just want to ramble about the show for a bit. So this video is sort of sorted into an intro to Dragon Booster about its settings, its characters, the general plot, as well as my review and like what I wish was part of the show. So, spoilers abound ahead. If you've never watched the show, this video will spoil so much and give you too much lore. So, I recommend watching it or like reading about it first. Um, a lot of the lore that I mentioned here is all referenced from the show itself, several of its like lore books in the past, as well as like the Magna Draconis, which was the Q&A from the early 2000s with Rob, as well as some of the info that Rob has mentioned recently in the most recent Q&A with him. So yeah, let's get into it. To start off, what is Dragon Booster? If you're watching this, you already know Dragon Booster is a 2004 Canadian cartoon by Rob Trevelino and Kevin Maurer from Nerd Cops. Some context to this show is that 3,000 years ago, a world-devastating dragon-human war occurred between 12 empires sorted by draconian color. The cause of this war was due to dragons sensing they were being abused by their human counterparts, as well as general fights for power, control, and territory. This interspecies war was stopped by the legendary black and gold dragon Bucephalus, who selected the human hero, the Dragon Booster. This duo stopped the fighting by reverting all dragons back to their original gold state. Unfortunately, history was gradually forgotten and dragons were once again bred, this time for amusement, service, commerce, trade, and the power of dragon racing. In doing so, humanity unwittingly changed the colors of dragon's draconium once again, with history essentially repeating itself with a second dragon-human war just about to come or coming soon. So in present day, we have Wordpain, a banished acolyte of the Dragon Priest, who wants to restart the Dragon-Human War by controlling dragons with his rave gear. His motive is essentially to trick them into believing that his gear will allow them to take revenge on humans, using their power to take over the city. So, in layman's terms, he's essentially uh, pretending he's on their side by giving them powerful gear, which will take over their minds, and then he'll use them to take over the city. So that's Word's brilliant plan. To counter that, we follow the adventures of Arthur Penn and his little brother Lance from Penn Stables. Their father, Connor Penn, has bred the legendary dragon Bo back to life. After a fire breaks out and their father goes missing, Bo selects Arthur and as the dragon booster, and the boys find themselves having to fend for themselves, to which Arthur decides to pick up racing. In addition to these two, they are joined by Pam and Sean, Arthur's longtime friend and tech geek, and Kit Wan, a skilled and experienced racer from Down City. The series then follows Arthur's hero's journey as he faces foes and finds allies, all culminating in the eventual academy, which was sadly cancelled. At the academy, however, he's meant to continue his training as the Dragon Booster and finally put a stop to both Word as well as the new antagonist, Armageddon's plans for a second Dragon Human war. Moving on, let's talk about the setting. So, Dragon Booster is set on Draconis in a tall, technologically advanced city called Dragon City. This city is about, I think, 32 kilometers tall, if I converted it right and I remember it correctly. And it's only possible for it to be this tall because it exists within a large crater, which I assume was caused by the Dragon Human War. Um, and this city is tiered with different levels serving different purposes and very much segregated by classes. Over in this diagram, you'll see all the different sections of Dragon City. Most of this is only briefly mentioned within the show, and I think only some parts of the city itself was actually shown within the show. So just to quickly go over different parts, we'll start with Sun City, which is at the very top. That's where the elite class racers hold their races. Essentially, what that means is all of the races for the academy sort of happen in that section. We don't actually see Sun City at all within the show. It's a city meant for the rich. That's also where Word Pain Citadel is. So I guess if you count seeing Word Pain Citadel as Sun City, that's all we get to see of Sun City. Moving on, we have Mid City, which, like the name implies, is mostly for middle class citizens. There's a lot of commerce and like shops and stuff like that. We do get to see quite a bit of Mid City in the show. It's usually where the all city races sort of start. Um, Especially when you see like Arthur and Mordred sort of like running through um all the shops and stuff. That's assumedly like mid city. So yeah, those are like the top two. Those two cities are in the sun essentially. Then we have Worktown, which I'm not too sure if we actually see it or not. Maybe we do, but Worktown is for working class citizens of Dragon City. There are a lot of factories that people work in and stuff like that. So think of it as like the very industrial section of Dragon City. Precinct, we do get a glimpse of, I think, in the Mechanist episode or something like that. Um, yeah, it's essentially the tier for Dragon City security. It's purely for law enforcement. Captain Fire is there. His giant laser that he points at the Down City citizens are there. And yeah, that's what this tier is for. Moving on, we have Shadow Town, which is essentially the generator or like the section of the city for generating electricity. And I think generally, I use a lot of generally, it's for creating power and like operating essential services and stuff like that for the rest of the city. And then finally, we have Down City, which is where the 12 crews sort of like hang out the most. It's also where the poorest communities of Dragon City sort of live. Essentially, it's the slums of Dragon City. Um, we see quite a bit of Down City within the show itself. Squire's End, which is mentioned in the show, is in Down City. Mordred's sort of like base is also there. So that's all set within Down City. The all city races generally, I think, go through all of Dragon City except Sun City. So if you watch the show, you'll see that um, the races sort of go between like this lit background to this dark city. It's either all the races happen within Mid City and like there's night and day there, or that these races sort of span all throughout these levels except where the rich and like powerful live. So yeah, I think that sort of covers Dragon City and its setting. The last tier in Dragon City is Old City, which is essentially the ruins of the First Dragon Human War. Um, Although it's mostly very like barren wastelands, there's quite a lot of life here and quite a lot of like different communities here. So, for example, the Dragonflare's crew base is here. Um, the Dragon Priest temples are littered throughout the wastelands. um, the Keeper's crew are also in hiding here, and the orange dragons are also the prophets are also here. Besides that, there's quite a lot of life in Old City. The Hydrax, there's the Mahora, In The Alchemist, they even mention some sort of like dog creature thing that works for the dragon priest. So there's quite a bit there. Moving on, let's talk about the characters. We'll start with the pen crew. So Arthur is a goofy teen with a lot of heart. Despite being rather simple, I think his coming of age story is pretty cool. The show does do a good job of showing how the stress and the pressure he's facing as a hero, as well as an older brother with a sibling to raise on his own. Thanks, Connor. Um, is affecting him. So he's ultimately a nuanced and good kid and a character that slowly but surely grows out of being an immature brat and into a hero that can believably save the world. Next, we have Lance, who's the heart of the show, who, with his childish and naive views of things around him, often bringing in fresh and new perspectives to both viewers as well as characters around him. One example is, of course, Mordred in the Wraith Booster episode, where Lance very easily sees through Mordred and like tells him like all these things about himself that he probably felt but never expressed. So Lance is very simply a kid who is a kid in the show. And it's been confirmed by Rob that he is meant to be the energy booster, that is the blue booster, if you're not too sure what that means. Um, so this suggests there might be a point in the future where his naivety has to be balanced out with actually growing up and maturing. Next, we have Parm, who has been Arda's friend for a while and whom he was going to make a game with. So this information wasn't mentioned in the show itself, but Tom's parents are not from Dragon City. Yes, there are other cities on Draconis, and his mother is actually a lecturer at the academy. Tom's often the scaredy cat of the group, but in moments where it's necessary, he will do all he can to help his friends. It's also been hinted at that he will be the power booster um, in the episode where he gets the power gauntlet. So that's like the green booster. And essentially, he's the steady ally to Arthur in the show. Next up, we have Kit, who's the skilled racer from Down City, um, who is also, interestingly enough, a solo racer. So Kit doesn't have any alliance or allegiance to other um, crew crews in Down City, and she joins Arthur very early on in the series and acts as his mentor of sorts. She eventually starts tagging along the boys' adventures, assisting with her skills. Later in the series, however, Arthur's prowess at racing does start to overtake hers, and she loses her chance to the academy because of that. This does drive a wedge between her and the others, but they eventually sort it out in a very short episode called Slittercorp. In my opinion, she's sort of given the unfortunate short stick with the abandoned romance plotline. um, I feel like she did have very little to do, but yeah, more on this in a bit. Kit is teased as the fire booster who will help Arthur in the Dragon Human War. She's not seen getting the gauntlet and amulet, but it's so heavily hinted she is the fire booster eventually. So that covers four boosters and the four members of Arthur's crew. Probably the last person to mention is Connor because he's also quite an interesting character with quite a bit of depth and history. He's the head of Penn Stables as well as secretly a dragon priest. For most of the series, he faked his death. Wow, such a great dad. And posed as Mortis, a mentor to Arthur and his crew. Besides being there to spill lore and lessons, past creators' notes have hinted at him being an imperfect good guy with his methods in the past being commented on as similar to words. This was in The Alchemist. Regardless, these flaws make him an interesting father figure to Arthur as he strives to do better. Next up, let's talk about the antagonists of the show. Of course, there is Word Payne, my favorite, father of Mordred Payne, and also Armageddon. I won't talk about the side antagonists too much, they're mostly like filler. But anyway, Word, he has a very interesting background with that is shared with Connor. He was once an acolyte of the Dragon Priest, and then he was expelled because of his experiments with gear, as well as because he attacked Connor. If you want to read about that whole um, thing, go read The Alchemist that covers that fight. So yeah, he gets booted out of the temples, eventually making it to Dragon City where he meets Zule, falls in love, gets involved with the Dragon Eyes, sets up Pain Incorporated, which is his gear empire, and essentially him and Zule go from dirt poor in Bound City to stinking rich in Sun City. Uh, and yeah, it's essentially this evil love plot thing. Unfortunately, Zule does perish, or I assume she dies, in an experiment gone wrong. So she was testing Word's experimental overload pod and unfortunately died. And in The Alchemist, I think there's some relation there to Word's hand, the clawed one. So I assume his hand was affected or like blasted off, and that's some sort of prosthetic. So Soleil dies. He uh, sort of slips a bit. Rob describes Zule as his sort of like conscience, and her death is pretty critical in him becoming extreme with his actions, which you can sort of see in The Alchemist because right after, like just a month after Zule dies, he does these drastic actions to steal Bo's egg, blast it with black draconium and stuff like that, which inadvertently results in Bo's birth, essentially. So like Bo is only a gold, black and gold dragon because we're metal and Zule died and stuff like that. So yeah, that's quite a lot to unpack there. Um, but yeah, that's a brief overview of Word's background as well as plot. I think he's very fascinating because like he started a family and wanted to continue having that family, but it was taken away and like yeah, he's just messed up. He's depressed. um, Moving on, we have Mordred, who is essentially, I think, another of like the more complicated characters in the show, and that's largely because of the issues his dad has. Um, due to Word's neglect, Mordred craves a lot of like the attention as well as affection from his father, which and also like approval. So he strives for this by being very um he tries very hard in like the races and stuff like that. He goes out of his way to be mean and things like that. But deep down, he does have a heart, as we can see in several episodes that hint at him being someone who will turn against his father and eventually side with Arthur and Co. Um, and he also is the Shadow Booster. So that's another layer of like past lore mixing with present day lore, so it's definite that Mordred will definitely work with Arthur, and with Battle of the Ages, where he works with Arthur as well as Dracus and Mortis. I think it's pretty safe to say that both the Pains and the Pens will have to put their differences aside and work together to stop the even bigger bad who's introduced in season 2, Armageddon. So, Armageddon is from 3,000 years ago. He was originally I think the leader of the Black Empire, he had eight dragons called the League of Eight. He was pretty darn terrible, and the only way the previous boosters managed to stop him was by fooling him and trapping him into the shadow track. So in present day, Armageddon has been released, as you see in Faster Than Fear, and he's back to revive the League of Eight and wants to destroy everything and start his own Dragon Human War and stuff like that. So, yes, he is, like his name, the end of the world, I guess. Yeah, he's not good news. And um, some fun facts about him is that unlike every other character in this show, uh, Armageddon is purely black draconium in his bones. He was not affected by the first Dragon Human Wars gold blast thing from the Dragon Booster and Bow. So that's probably why his black draconium skills and stuff like that, like the macro and stuff, is really powerful because he's pure black draconium in his bones. Even Word Pain, even Mordred have like traces of gold draconium as well as other draconium colors in their bones. So that's the one oddity about Armageddon, which is interesting to mention. So yeah, I enjoy the villains of the show so much. There's so much potential there for like dramatic stories. I love them. Moving on, I think I just wanted to mention a bit about like several side characters. There are like the Council of 12, which are essentially crew leaders and like the racers as part of the All City races. I don't have too much to say about them because they're not too complicated characters. Their arcs are pretty simple. Um, they're either generally foes to the pen crew or allies. But I do see the trend of like eventually all of these crews will help out Arthur in some shape or form to stop Armageddon because he's just that huge a force. This is especially hinted at in the Defiance episode where Arthur and Bo managed to stop the fighting. Um, True, like yeah, gold draconium sort of resonating with everyone, and yeah, so that's really it that I can talk about the concept of. I do have my criticisms of like how they're written as side characters, but I think that's too much to go into. Let's move on. The other sort of group I want to discuss a bit is the Dragon Priests because they are an interesting group that doesn't get a whole lot of coverage in the show beyond what we are told. And generally, they're thought of as like the good guys and stuff like that, but they're kind of sus as well because it's because of them we have Word and Connor who caused all of this stuff. The Second Dragon Human War. Like, why does the pupil of this group want to start a second Dragon Human War? Shouldn't he be educated in like their values against it and everything? So it's interesting, but there's such a gray, I guess, morally gray group. And if you think about it, like Connor and Word were training from young, it does feel a bit like they were being trained to be child soldiers of a sort, and that's just my personal headcanon. But yeah, fascinating group. They kind of like a dragon cult. They essentially are. I mean, they're isolated from the rest of society. Um, and they have weapons and they have their own culture and stuff like that. So it's interesting, and I just thought it'd be cool to mention. Moving on, in this last section of this video, I just wanted to go through a few of my thoughts on the show itself, as well as share some of what I think were a few things that should have been tweaked or could have been improved, as well as like some of my ideas for like a revised or a reboot version of Dragon Booster that could be potentially better. Um,
I obviously really love this show. It's what got me started drawing 18, 19 years ago. And it's been like a huge inspiration for me as an artist and a creator, as well as a storyteller. Um, I love all the characters and the depth of like this universe. It's probably one of the few fantasy universes which I can really get immersed into, and I am very, very much in love with at the moment. Finding it again after so long. So, um, despite all that, I do have a lot of, I suppose, spicy opinions on what I think are issues within the show itself, or things that I think could have been fixed or changed or tweaked so that narratively the show could have like been better for all the characters involved, and we could get like a better resolved storyline of everything. So I guess this is kind of like what I think were some issues in the show, and then what I'd like a reboot of it to look like, or my version of the reboot. Since I don't want to write or draw it out too much anymore. I've already drawn and written too much for this show. Um, yeah, so let's start. I think the main thing that sort of um, is my thought and like a negative thing within the show is that the dragon sentience and abuse issue was the central conflict within the show, and it's the thing that sparked the dragon human war, which is an interspecies war, which has all these things about dragons being abused, being enslaved, and all those feelings I feel are really fair and valid, and like that's an issue definitely. And then this would yeah, it started a war, there's this conflict, but then I feel like within the show, probably because it's for kids, this sort of like moral issue, it's a moral issue, but like this issue isn't explored in very much in great depth. Pretty much the only character who sort of like brings it up as it is Prophecy himself, who talks about dragons being unfairly treated in Dragon City, and that humans have forgotten that like we are actually equal citizens to you. You shouldn't be using us for entertainment, transportation. You shouldn't be enslaving us. You shouldn't be um, breeding us specifically for specific traits. That's a bit messed up if you consider that dragons are an equal species to humans. They have the same intelligence, they have their own traditions, culture, um, so forth. So, yeah, I don't think the show covered very much of it at all. If you look at like the people in Dragon City, no one really mistreats their dragons like outright. And honestly, when I was a kid and like when I watched the show, that concept did not register whatsoever. And it's not like it's a concept that has not been shown in media. You see it in Pokemon, the entirety of like, for example, Pokemon Black and White is about using Pokemon as like tool or whatever, and like the ethical implications of it. So like in Dragon Booster, that doesn't come up whatsoever. Fistus treats his dragon well. Pyra, maybe at the beginning there was some bits there with like wanting to control her dragon a bit better, but it's not really explicitly said that like hey, do what I want. You're not doing what I want. Go, move, whatever. And like that doesn't happen in the show whatsoever. So like everyone is like really nice to their dragon. It doesn't come up whatsoever unless like you really like put on binoculars and go like, okay, they're racing the dragons. That's instantly like enslavement and like abuse. But like you don't even know the dragons have this level of intelligence and like same level of, I guess, yeah, same level of intelligence or whatever with humans. It's easy enough to just see the show and be like, oh, they're like horses, and like, yeah, horses are sentient and everything, but like they're not equal in terms of like, they're not almost like people in the sense that like yeah, that's just that difference there that like I think makes this a really difficult sort of subject to explore within fiction. And I think in general as well, when these sorts of like inequality, like these very real issues like inequality, racism, and slavery, etc., when you use like fantasy elements to sort of like explore these topics, it's very easy to do it in a way which is, I think, doesn't do the concept justice. And I think like Dragon Booster is sadly a case of that, but at the same time, they didn't really show it very much, so it didn't really come up too often either. I guess like to sort of like give an example of this, um, for Pokemon, it's a bit hard to say that there are two sides to this abuse thing because like everyone is actively abusing their Pokemon regardless. So yeah. And then like for example, Zootopia is like talking about discrimination of like I think the vegetarian the carnivorous and like the um non yeah, basically interspecies like differences between species and stuff like that and the inequality from there. But they use it in the sense of like whether you're carnivorous or not. And it's just not a very good vibe, and I feel like there were so many other things to Dragon City that could have been used instead to sort of explore this issue and like by making it non-dragon versus human, Arthur and Cole could have explored it in greater depth. And when you have that, I guess it's easier to sort of write the story. Maybe not easier, but it's easier to sort of have more room to play with rather than like it becoming very childish of a sort, if that makes sense. So, yeah, I think like my sort of solution to this would be to just immediately like scrap this um, dragon sentience and abuse thing being the central conflict. Because like if you think too hard, then like Word becomes someone like Peter and like yeah, it gets messy really quickly. Um, and my solution to this is I think just cut it out. Um, don't make that the main thing that fuel the dragon human war. Instead, try to go more human instead of like, yeah, and like focus on dragon cities, for example, tiered levels for the poor and the rich, which is like, yeah, there's already a class system in this city. Why not just use that to sort of like explain that there's this bubbling tension within the city. People in Down City are unhappy that they're in Down City, their lives are really hard, and this immediately ties to the Council of 12 having a bit more stuff to bring to the table. All of them are unhappy, they want to revolt, they want to have better lives. And then Arta can come in and be like this mid-city kid who's sort of learning a bit more about life in Down City and like how it's different to his experiences. And then through this, as the Dragon Booster, he has to sort of like see where his stance is and like how he can stop this conflict from happening because there will be people who want to take advantage of this, which is basically someone like Word. So that all like fits still with like all the players we have in this show, without the mess of like complicated issues like the dragons. If you think of them as like people and being forced to like be bred for certain purposes or whatever, and like oh that's just opening up a really dark chapter of like humanity itself, and using fictional dragons as something to explore that topic is, in my opinion, a bit insensitive. Like it's really easy to get into that weird stage. Yeah. So I think like we can avoid all of that entirely and just use existing human conflicts and like troubles to sort of explore this tension in Dragon City and the Dragon Booster's role to sort of mediate it. Um, I guess it's also important to mention that I do realize that this sort of makes the dragon slightly less interesting, maybe. But I think it's easier to, or like better to view the dragons as like an additive to this show. So like having the dragons in Dragon City sort of like make things more complicated because like these dragons are really powerful, and maybe a difference between like the upper levels and the lower levels is that the lower levels, people have closer relations to the dragon. The dragon is like a more essential part of life. People up at the top are rich. They don't really need dragons anymore. They have machines, they have tech, they have money, whatever. So in a sense, I think like the dragons could be more important in that way, in that down city people, for down city people, dragons are a way of life, and that we can illustrate sort of like how they live and like how it's like the example and like how they do have valid reasons for like their discontent and why they sort of want to like go up to Sun City and fight or whatever. Um, I think as well, I in the past I did do a few revisions of like the structure of Dragon City itself. So right now, Precinct sort of lies in the middle of Dragon City, and it's said that Precinct is the layer of security that sort of like enforces law and order both up top as well as bottom. But I was thinking, this is like the perfect setup for an extremely dystopian scenario where Precinct is basically guarding the sort of interests of Sun City as well as Mid City, and then everyone else is from like Work Town all the way to Down City. They just point their giant lasers, and as a result of that, they sort of like have to they're forced to do all these work and these things to serve the elites up at the top. And people like Word, for example, would become a villain who sort of like stokes that sentiment into something extremely violent, whilst most of Down City are actually just people wanting better lives for themselves. So someone like Arthur will have moments where he has to fight, as well as issues where fighting isn't the solution. It's more about mediating and understanding people around him. Which brings me to the topic of Kit, actually, because Kit in the original series, she's from Down City. She's a racer from Down City. She's experienced and everything. But in canon, what happens to her story is that she ends up competing with Arthur. And because of that, she ends up being sidelined a bit at the end of the series. And I think she ends up being someone who doesn't have very much to do anymore in the show. So I was thinking if this was the setup for Dragon Booster, and that like this sort of class difference becomes something more important, Kit on the Pen crew would have her down city experiences as well as like people she knows. She knows the area, she knows how things work, how people are discontent and everything. She brings all of that to the table and her experience. And I think she could just be a mentor to Arthur in this way because she can go like, actually, Arthur, you had a privileged life. This is actually the reality, and this is my advice to you as like a person to the Dragon Booster. And yeah, that just gives her so much more depth and like things to do as well. Probably another thing for her, I feel, is she shouldn't have been someone racing against Arthur. I think she should have just been someone who's just the mentor to Arthur, immediately older, immediately more experienced, etc. And that doesn't change in throughout the course of the show. So um, I suppose maybe a potential solution for this would be like Kit's actually um, she was from Down City and then she graduated from the academy already, but somehow she decides to go back to Down City to help out fellow racers there, and that's how she meets Arthur. And so there's always this sort of like difference between the two of them in that um, Kit is always teaching Arthur, and then Arthur and stuff is like giving her new experiences in the form of like Dragon Boosters, new responsibilities. So I think that sort of cements her role and like purpose within the team slightly more. So those are my suggestions. And not saying she can't race in the races, but I feel like letting her fight against Arthur like this and then having her give up all of that just for Arthur to, because Arthur is bound to like grow and like win and everything. So she's set up to fail. And I feel like we have so few female characters in the show. Why not give her a role which isn't like this? So yeah, that those are my solutions to Kit. And in general, like I think the setting or like focusing on the dystopian setting of Dragon City a bit more would just help out all these characters become more in depth and like fascinating and interesting to like see them grow and like go about all these conflicts and things like that. Um, I've suppose I've discussed like the pen crew and things. Um, Oh, and on this note, I guess like the only person in the show, the pen crew, all of them except Kit are from like mid city or like more privileged backgrounds. So Kit having this experience should have been the person who goes like, "Oh, you don't really know how to take care of yourself. I've been taking care of myself all this while. Let me help you, blah, blah, blah." And yeah, it just play into that a bit more, and she'd have so much more to do and so much more purpose in the team. Um, I suppose that covers the protagonists. As for like antagonists, I do think one issue with the canon stuff was that the villain's motive is very murky until like I think season 3 when you hear Connor ramble about his past with Wood in the Dragon Priesthood. Only then you sort of like piece together Wood's motives a bit more. But even then, because like the whole thing about the dragons versus humans thing and like the inequality there, because that wasn't too like clear. Wood's motives were never clear, and like you can't really get into it very much beyond like, oh, he's a mad scientist who's going, ha ha ha, I want to rule the world. But yeah, there's not too much there for you to pick on it unless you read like the lore and get more details about it in after you watch the show. So I think with this setup of like Dragon City being very segregated and everything, what Word's sort of motive could be is that we lean into him being a disgraced acolyte from the Dragon Priest, keep that the same. The only reason he gets exiled is because he experimented on gear when he wasn't supposed to, and he gets exiled. He goes to Down City. He meets Zule. All of this is sort of canon, but the lens on it is slightly different. So um, he meets Zule, who is a Down City citizen, and as a Down City citizen, she knows the scenario locally and the sort of discontent amongst the people there, and like how there's sentiments about people wanting to revolt, blah blah blah, and yeah, that there's this tension in Down City, and Zule, let's make her a genuinely bad person. She's genuinely a bad person with a lot of charisma. She's fearless, blah, blah, blah. She's the Dragon Eye leader. And she meets Word. Both of them become this evil tag team. Word's the mad scientist. Zule is this sort of evil leader who's very good at getting people to work for her. So think of her, I guess, as like a mafia leader or someone, or like a figurehead for discontent people in Down City to sort of like rally towards. So, of course, not everyone in Down City would agree with her or her methods and stuff like that. So that's sort of like the scenario in Down that's sort of like the political divides within Downside itself. And then part of that strategy is, of course, them building up Pain Incorporated together. So the whole idea that uh, Word and Zulay have is to gather as many unhappy Down City citizens, and then word would come in with building all this gear and like powerful weapons and stuff like that. And the idea is to overthrow Precinct. I mentioned Precinct earlier being the thing that sort of controls the bottom levels or threatens the bottom levels so that they work for the elites and stuff. So their sort of like strategy is to be able to take down those crazy lasers in Precinct, and then like through that control the entirety of like the bottom of Dragon City, and then after that they set up their own authoritarian regime throughout Dragon City. So in the guise of being for the people, blah blah blah. So this sounds really familiar to like the for the dragons rationale word had, but it makes more sense because it's not species based, it's by class, um, by the class of the people and stuff like that. So they build up Pain Incorporated. They are very much ready to go to war and like attack Dragon City. It's almost a Cold War because you might not need to go have like an all out fight. It could just be like they threaten Precinct and everything to the point where like they just surrender or whatever. But one very crucial moment is that Zule dies, and it's towards experimental gear. So one thing in The Alchemist that I found kind of grating was that Zule's death, besides affecting Word emotionally, does nothing else. So she is the wife of this super powerful, rich person, very influential businessman. But her death by gear made by him from this company does nothing whatsoever. There's no impact. There's no impact whatsoever besides on Word emotionally. He's grieving, he goes a bit local. But other than that, it does nothing. Pain Incorporated gets into its fourth highest sales or something, and like they celebrate. Word celebrates with wine and women a month after his wife dies. Yeah, I just think like Zlay and her death and that impact should have been something that is used as like an important like plot step, I guess. And not only that, this just gives her character um, it just makes her more important rather than like a character who's fridged just for words, emotional change or development or whatever. So, and even Mordred's like later development or redemption. So, with this happening, I suggest that like Zule's death causes Pain Incorporated to sort of depower by a lot. So people become scared to use Pain Incorporated gear because the co-founder died by the gear made by this company. So there's that sort of like making words influence sort of less powerful. Besides that, the Dragon Eyes lose their leader, and I don't think it's too far like too out of the ways to say that like they might have thought or like they blame that Word for killing her. So in that sense, Word does lose his army. He has no men. Men and dragons are like manpower, let's just say. Man and dragon power, I guess. To go about with Zule's plan, Zule and his plans to take over Dragon City, and then all the stuff about the egg, Bo's egg and stuff, all of that comes back to Word, and he goes crazy. He goes and steals the egg, and he blasts it with dragon black draconium. All of this in a desperate attempt to continue the takeover plans with his wife posthumously. So all of Word's sort of like villainous actions after this fact is in the name of my dead wife. And I think that sort of like it sets up this like second arc for this villain because like the initial arc is very plain. It's very much for personal gain, personal greed, whatever. But then after Zulay dies, that changes a bit and becomes something like, in the memory of my loved one, I will commit all these heinous crimes or whatever. And it also ties into why Word would look into Wraith gear in the later part of the series. So this person who supposedly has all the resources available in canon, why doesn't he buy an army? Yeah, he doesn't need Mordred to work for him anymore. So by depowering Word during this time, I think it sets up this sort of villain character who will be trying to crawl up and gain more power. And that also explains why his plans sort of take sort of 16-year hiatus until like he gets his Wraith gear going and like his Wraith army going. Why he pushes Mordred so hard because he needs someone like Zule to fill that element of the plan. And for Mordred, it just becomes more tragic because instead of the shadow of his father, it's actually the shadow of his dead mother that he has to try and escape. And I think it also still makes Zule relevant later in the series in that Mordred's redemption is very much tied to his father. So him and Word will need to eventually resolve their relationship in the sense that like actually Mordred has to go like actually that I cannot be who you want me to be um, and Word also has to realize that Zule is gone. Those plans cannot go forward anymore, and he should stop for the sake of Mordred, who is, of course, the Shadow Booster. So all of that, I think, sort of like makes the entire Pain family dynamic slightly more grounded rather than like the current one, which is like a word that is very happy sacrificing his son, despite being someone who's apparently afraid to lose him just like he lost Zule. So I think doing all of this sort of gives Word, I guess it supposedly makes Word a slightly better dad-ish. I'm envisioning him to be a slightly better dad, yeah. But I think it works in Mordred's favor because I do feel like Mordred's redemption arc I need more like ties to his father to sort of like rationalize this whole redemption thing. And I think in canon, the issue is that Word is too um, black and white. Not black and white, but like less complex, or like that complexity isn't explored enough for me to go like, why the hell does Mordred care about his dad? I don't know. Like, I can't envision how the series would end because Armageddon is introduced later on. I do feel like Armageddon should be a villain who is the giant big bad in this series because he's just the one who moves the plot. He's a plot device to make everyone, including Arthur and everyone else, develop and become more skilled, get more allies, change for the better, etc. So Armageddon can be the big bad, the big villain who is very simple, very like, I'm just here to destroy everything, blah blah blah. Whereas in canon, both Word and Armageddon are said to be very similar in motive, and I don't see the point of that. So, in summary, make Word less of an ass, make it possible for him and his son to have some sort of resolution, maybe referencing like parents who apologize in from series like Everything Everywhere All at Once, or like Encanto, etc. Like those sort of show, those vibes with like parents and kids like resolving differences and intergenerational trauma. Yeah. So, but of course here it's a bit more complicated because Word is an evil, greedy dude. But yeah, there's more stuff there. And yeah, make our Megalon the one who can carry all the very yeah, make Armageddon the simpler a villain character to push everyone to great extents. I just think this sort of would have a clearer end for the Dragon Booster series. So like, um, instead of this question mark on how Word and Mordred would sort of resolve in canon. Like in my head, canon would either A, make Word suddenly care for his son by a lot, B, kill him off, which I don't know, he redeems himself by sacrificing himself for Mordred at the very end, or I guess C, he see after Megadon is defeated, Word continues his schemes, and like our end of Dragon Booster is basically Arthur continuing his everyday crime fighting against Word, which whose plans never go anywhere. So yeah, it's a bit murkier if we don't make Word someone who has a chance of sort of like, maybe he's not entirely good, but he's willing to change for his son, sort of type. And then Mordred as well. Maybe what we can do with him is make him slightly more, make his morals slightly stronger in the sense that, unlike both of his evil parents, Mordred is very much someone with a heart, and it's more consistently shown throughout the show. His yeah, his values don't shake or waver as much as they do in the show. In canon, Mordred goes from saving Lance to later in season three blasting a bunch of concrete onto him. So yeah, it's very up and down with canon Mordred, and I think like having both parents be terrible evil, but then like one parent is affected very much by the death of like the loved one, and to the point where like all these villainous plans are kind of just like a means to continue their memory. That sort of like helps with Mordred standing up as, actually I am not like my parents whatsoever. I want to step out of their shadows. And yeah, I think making Mordred have more of a spine is a good thing. Um, does it make him less interesting? I'm not sure. I can only speculate. Um, I've done quite a few other like drawings, comics, and animations on how all of this could go. Not a very good writer myself, but I do think this sort of like serves to make a beginning and end for Mordred's character arc clearer, and then Word as well gets that resolution, and then Armageddon, of course, his arc is basically being revived, dies at the end, defeated, and then the pen crew and everything is basically helping Mordred, or being like Mordred's found family of sort, and like pushing him towards facing his father in that way. And yeah, I think it's clear this way that like how the series could end, whereas like canon right now is kind of like, mm, how would these characters sort of like resolve themselves? It feels very vague. And yeah, I think we have a lot of room for more complex characters who have things that they need to face and fix by the end of the series. So yeah, Kit is experienced. Kit has a lot to bring to the table, as well as learn from Arthur himself. And then Arthur um, learns from Kit. Parm, etc. Yeah, all of this comes together better in my head, at least. That's what I think. I don't know. I think like the setting for the segregation of Dragon City, it also helps with the side characters. Give the side characters a bit more like depth in the sense that you see, I don't know, some characters, despite struggling very much in Down City, they decide to be bigger people. They help out others regardless of like their draconium color or whatever. Yeah, and whereas there are also people who like, for example, the turquoise crew or like the purple crew, they go about sort of defending their own, but that's also like a valid sort of view on life because life is hard in Down City. So all these different perspectives sort of like it just gives those crews slightly more depth and like Arthur as a mid-city kid and new Dragon Booster interacting with them would be slightly more complicated and like interesting and less one-off as well because all of these interactions end up contributing to this larger arc of actually how are we going to handle this discontent from Down City. The very clear answer is definitely do not listen to Word, but also Word has things you could contribute to help people at the bottom, and that help could be spearheaded by someone like Arthur as well as all the other boosters eventually later in the series. So yeah, that's my thoughts. I've rambled on long enough, I think. This has gone on way longer than I thought it would, but I hope you enjoyed this ramble on Dragon Booster as well as my thoughts on what could have been done instead. If you have differing ideas, opinions, feel free to share because all of this is just speculation from me and just for fun for me, to be honest, because I love making alternate universes or like alternate canon, things like that. It's just too much fun with this show and this setting. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this very long video essay. Peace.